The sex attacks on New Year's Eve in Cologne and other European cities have shone a spotlight on the problems associated with mass immigration. The response of leftists has been denial. The attacks didn't really happen, or if they did, it had nothing to do with immigration or Islam. Liberals, on the other hand, and I do make that distinction between liberals and leftists, liberals have been somewhat more honest. True liberals will admit that there is a problem, but they view it as entirely cultural, as something that is caused by retrograde ideas and can be solved by education. They believe that the Muslims are basically backwards, that they have a backwards belief system, and they need to be brought up to the current, modern, and correct Western standards. And if we do this, then the Muslims may even thank us for teaching them our superior ways. And I think this view is not only based on fallacious reasoning, it is also dangerously naive. It ignores the reality of human nature. There is more going on here than just a clash between Muslim values and modern Western values. There is something deeper and biological that is being brought to the surface by this migration. And I don't mean racial differences, although there may be some racial differences. There's an important aspect of this migration that until recently has mostly been ignored. The sex ratio of the migrants is incredibly biased. The majority are young single men, and almost none of them are young single women. This migration is creating a sexual imbalance in Europe. It is adding a lot of young single men to the sexual market, where they will be competing with European men for European women. And this would cause problems even if there were no cultural differences and no biological differences between the two populations. This is not going to have a happy ending. Now, why do liberals have the attitude that they do? The main difference between liberals and leftists is one of, to some extent, intelligence and open-mindedness. They both have the same basic religion, which I would call humanism. Humanism is based on an idealistic conception of human nature, and as such, it ignores the reality of human nature. Humanists are blinded by their ideal notion of humanity to the truth about human nature. And one of the most important facts about human nature that they ignore is the fact that humans compete, and that life itself is intrinsically competitive. Now, life is not just competition. Humans can and do cooperate, and other life forms cooperate. You have gut bacteria, right? And they are cooperating with your body. But life is fundamentally competitive. That's just built into the nature of life. Even though there is cooperation, it takes place within a larger context of competition. And that fact is hard for humanists to accept because it destroys not only their ideal conception of human nature, which is kind of lovey-dovey and nicey-nicey, it destroys their fantasy of universal love, that we will all get along just by being nice, by having the right feelings, the right attitudes towards each other. If we just care about each other, if we just have empathy, if we are just altruistic, then everything will work out fine. But that's not how nature works, and we are part of nature. that is just a fantasy. The reality is that people compete for resources, and they also compete for sex. In an environment with abundant resources, such as the modern West, sexual competition comes to the forefront. It becomes the main competition between human beings. Life becomes mainly a game of sexual competition. Men compete for women, and women compete for men. I'm going to focus on male competition for women because that's what matters here. A lot of men have been brought into the sexual market, and they are going to compete for women. One way in which men compete for women is war. War is not just about attaining political objectives or seizing land and resources. That is our modern view of war, but that's a very sanitized, politically correct, and historically incomplete view of war. War is also, and even primarily, about seizing women and killing men and children. That's what tribal warfare is like. Take ISIS, for example. ISIS is engaged in tribal warfare, or at least the kind of warfare they are carrying out resembles tribal warfare, the ancient form of warfare that was common to all human beings wherever they lived. And in that kind of warfare, the sexual motive is explicit. Men kill other men, and they often kill children, and they seize women as sex slaves or as wives, or they rape them and abandon them. So there is a sexual motive to warfare. And, you can see this in ISIS, right? They take sex slaves. They capture Yazidi women as sex slaves after killing the men and probably killing the children as well. And this sounds very barbaric, but that is normal human behavior. That is how people behaved throughout almost all of history. That was the normal practice of warring tribes and invading armies in almost all times and places, such as when the Russians invaded Germany in World War II. They were massacring men and children and raping women. That's what happened. Humanists cannot accept this because they believe that violence is bad, and they believe that humans are basically good. So they can't accept that humans are intrinsically violent, that human beings have an innate propensity toward violence. Humanists would like to believe that war is an aberration, not a natural human behavior. But war is a natural human behavior. And what prevents war, and more generally what prevents violence, is civilization. It is the threat of violence from the state. It is the imposition of law and order. It is not the goodness of our natures that prevents violence. It is the structure of our societies that prevents internal violence. Now, within those societies where violence is prohibited, men still compete for women, but they compete in nonviolent ways. And that's what I call the sexual market. The sexual market is the arena of sexual competition within a society. It is constrained by the laws and norms of the society. Within the sexual market, men compete in various ways. They may compete economically, intellectually, or aesthetically, but they still compete. The sexual market is nonviolent, but it is still a competition. It has winners and losers. And the way you create the sexual market is by imposing nonviolence on men. So it is civilization that turns the violent competition for sex into the nonviolent and more productive competition that takes place within the sexual market. The opposite of the sexual market would be sexual anarchy, where anything goes, including rape. Just as humanists have a hard time accepting the truth about war and violence, they have a hard time accepting the truth about love and sex, because they can't admit that love is in fact a competition, and sex is a means to reproduction. They don't want to see human nature for what it is: selfish, shaped by evolution, and driven by biological imperatives. They want to ignore the brute facts of sexuality and violence, because it would falsify their ideal conception of human nature. Now, how does this relate to the mass immigration into Europe of Muslim men? Well, it has distorted the sexual market, and this is going to be a big problem. It's not going to be some temporary problem of assimilating these men into European society and culture, even if that were easily done, which I don't think it would be. But even if that were easy to do, the problem of sexual imbalance would remain. And we already have in the West severely dysfunctional sexual markets because we have abandoned traditional marriage. So men are no longer competing by offering lifelong commitments to women. Instead, they are competing for a roll in the hay, right? And because dick is worth less than pussy, even with a balanced population of men and women, a lot of men in the modern West drop out of the sexual market. They find it almost impossible to get laid, and thus almost impossible to get a girlfriend or a wife. Now, nobody really talks about those guys, unless it is to ridicule them as losers. But there are a lot of guys like that, and this is a natural consequence of the abandonment of traditional marriage and the fantasy that men and women are the same, right? This egalitarian fantasy. So the sexual market was already a very hostile environment for a lot of men. And adding a large number of young men to this already dysfunctional market is going to make it a lot worse. And this is going to have repercussions. Now, let me just go through some numbers to show you that this problem is not trivial. It's not a tiny little detail, but it's kind of important. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that there were 500,000 more young men than young women in the recent migration into Germany. Now, that number is probably low, because the total size of the migration was something like 1.1 million people. And I think roughly 70% of them were men, and even the children in that migration were probably skewed toward being male. But let's just say it was only 500,000 men that were added to the sexual market above the number of women that were added, right? Because maybe a few single women came in that refugee flow, although it wasn't very many. So I'm going to use that number as a low estimate, all right? That would mean that 500,000 men would be eliminated from the sexual market, at least. At least 500,000 men just lost the chance of getting a girlfriend or a wife. Okay. And that is within a population of roughly 10 million young men, depending on the age range you use. But that's the population you need to compare to the size of the migration. You see, comparing the size of the migration to the size of the entire German population is very misleading. What you should do is compare the size of the migration to the size of the young male population in Germany, which is much smaller than the entire population of Germany. Not only are men only half the population, But because Germany has an aging population, there aren't that many young men in Germany. So the relative size of this migration is actually pretty large when you compare it that way. It's roughly 1 out of every 20 young men in Germany. And what just happened is now at least 1 in every 20 young men are going to drop out of the market, because it hasn't increased the size of the young single female population of Germany, just the young single male population. So it is going to increase male competition. Some of the dropouts from the sexual market will be Germans, and some will be migrants. Of course, I don't know what percentage of the migrants will get a German girlfriend or wife, and what percentage will simply fall out of the market themselves. So, again, I'm going to make an assumption for the sake of argument. Let's assume that 50% of the migrant men, the young male population within the migrants, get a German girlfriend or wife. If that were the case, then 250,000 German men just got kicked to the curb by their government. They now have no chance of getting a girlfriend or a wife in Germany, right? Of course, we don't know who they are. But by skewing the sex ratio in the population, the government has basically fucked over a huge number of German men. And that is a much bigger catastrophe than the 100 or so women who got sexually assaulted and robbed in Cologne on New Year's Eve. It's basically completely fucking up the lives of thousands and thousands of men. But the media will never talk about this kind of thing, or at least they won't talk about it in these terms. And if German men complain about the effects of this migration on their chances of getting female companionship, then they will simply be labeled as losers and ridiculed, right? No one will shed a tear for the young single men of Germany who now will have to drop out of the sexual market. But they will shed a tear for a German girl who got a finger shoved up her anus, right? That's more sensational. She makes a better victim. But those women are less victims of this migration than thousands of unnamed men, whose lives have been made dramatically worse. They will also have to compete with the migrants for jobs, right? And they will also have to pay taxes to support those migrants. Of course, the feminists in Europe have notably been in favor of this mass migration, and also conspicuously unconcerned with sexual violence perpetrated by Muslims in Europe. And this doesn't surprise me, because I don't take feminists or feminism at face value. I'm sure that feminists would be up in arms if the migration consisted mainly of cute Japanese girls. You know, if there were a whole bunch of cute Japanese girls swarming into Germany, the feminists would be up in arms. They would probably be rioting, you know. They would be marching in the streets. But a migration of young Muslim men is celebrated, even when those young men violate the cultural norms that feminism supposedly is so concerned with imposing on men. And this is an example of revealed versus stated preferences. The stated preferences of feminists do not match the preferences revealed by their actions. They don't really care about rape. They just use the idea of rape to bash men, right, as a class. But they don't care about actually reducing rape. Nothing they do has that effect. Because of this mass migration, thousands and thousands of European men will have to live their lives without love, sex, or children. Now, will these men have an incentive to contribute to the society that denied them those things Will they be content to clean up the trash, to sweep the floors, to run the factories, to fix the cars, to do the plumbing? I don't know, but I think many of them will rebel one way or another. And, of course, the migrants who find themselves in Europe in a difficult sexual market are going to employ their own strategies to get pussy, because that's what men are motivated to do. And this problem of sexual imbalance is not just confined to this Muslim migration into Europe, although it's more pronounced in that migration. It's a general problem of immigration that immigrant populations are not balanced in various ways. You tend to get men migrating more than women. And the effect is to displace local men from the sexual market. And this is true whether it is high-end professional migrants like H-1B visa holders in the U.S. or farm laborers. They skew the sex ratio in the place that they migrate to, and also in the place that they leave. They leave behind a surplus of women. Another problem with immigration is that some immigrant communities stigmatize or punish women for dating or marrying outside the community, while Western cultures and societies are highly tolerant of women making those choices. In the West, we tend to treat women as individuals who are free to choose their sexual partners. This is not true of many other cultures, and Islam is one of those cultures. Muslims tend to guard their women. They tend to keep them in the community. So even if Muslim immigrants had a balanced sex ratio, even if there were a whole bunch of cute, young Muslim girls coming in with those guys, most of them would not enter the Western sexual market, while many of the men would. So again, it would still create an imbalance. And that imbalance actually persists for multiple generations, right? Any community that guards its females creates an imbalance if it is within a community that does not. Now, you can think of this as a group expansion strategy. Prohibiting outgroup marriage for women while permitting outgroup marriage for men helps to expand the group, because men will find wives outside the group and then bring them into the community. And of course, this is especially effective if it is coupled with polygamy, which Islam allows, right? Islam as a religion, as a culture, permits polygamy for men. Men can have multiple wives. But it's not just the Muslims who have employed this strategy subconsciously. The Mormons used this strategy in the United States to expand very rapidly during the 19th century. Mormon girls were often married at very young ages to Mormon elders who had multiple wives and many children. Young Mormon men were encouraged to go outside the community to seek wives and then bring them back. If they succeeded and they contributed to the Mormon community, then they were rewarded by being allowed to have additional wives. So, if you were a productive, contributing, and loyal member of the Mormon community as a man, you would end up getting multiple wives. And that's a big incentive for guys, right? In your 30s and 40s, you get a beautiful young girl as a wife and as a reward for keeping the faith. On the other hand, if men broke the rules of the community, they could be expelled, right? And this wouldn't slow down the reproductive capacity of the community. Because if there were more women than men, polygamy allowed those women to be married, to be second wives. So this allowed the Mormons to have a very high reproductive rate for both men and women. The women got married young, And they had a lot of children because they started their reproductive lifespan early. And men got multiple wives. And that's one of the reasons why Mormonism expanded so rapidly. You can think of it as an adaptation to resource abundance. In an environment of resource abundance, the best reproductive strategy is to just have lots and lots of kids, right? Now, Europeans, coming from Europe where resources were scarce, they tended to have relatively small families and invest more in each child. But in the New World, there was an abundance of land, so you could feed a large family. And so behaviors changed, and new belief systems, new ways of life emerged, such as Mormonism. And polygamy was just one of those adaptations, but it was a very effective adaptation. And that's probably why Islam has been so successful, because they allowed for polygamy. And also, I'm sure that centuries of polygamous breeding has had some effect on the innate personality traits of the population. When you allow polygamy, that changes the selective pressures on human beings, right? It changes what reproductive strategies work the best. Polygamy increases the reproductive reward for men who ascend to the top of the social hierarchy because they can have multiple wives and many children. But it also means that a lot of men drop to the bottom and drop out of the sexual market. And what Islam has done with this surplus male population is it has pushed them to seek women outside the community by warfare, and in doing so to expand the Muslim community. And this is how Islam has expanded, by warfare, by men going to war for women. Islamic societies tended to be quite warlike and to boil off a lot of their male population in warfare. War was part of life. It was built into the life of the community, as it is built into all tribal societies. Islam is kind of a hybrid between civilization and tribalism, and it's a very effective hybrid. It works. I think we're in for an interesting decade or so. This migration is going to have long-term consequences for Europe, negative consequences, especially if the flow is not stopped. And as I have said before, there is no end to this flow. The Middle East and Africa can generate an unlimited number of people, especially since they are keeping the people-generating machinery, the women, and exporting the men. Their populations are going to continue to grow, while the white population of Europe is declining. And while they can export an unlimited number of people, Europe cannot absorb an unlimited number of people, and especially it cannot absorb an unlimited number of young single men without having a civilizational collapse. What will hundreds of thousands of Muslim men do if they can't find girlfriends and wives in Europe? What will hundreds of thousands of European men do when they are pushed out of an already dysfunctional sexual market? Will they be willing to contribute to a society that offers them nothing but a life of loneliness and frustration? I don't think so. Prepare for war. That's my advice. Thanks for listening.